Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Adaptive Leadership in a Changing World. My name is Liz Weaver and I'm the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, and I have particular responsibility as the strategic lead for the Tamarack Learning Center. I'm here today to introduce our discussion and introduce you to our speaker and host this webinar. And our speaker today is Liz Skelton. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction about Liz. Liz Skelton is renowned in Australia and internationally for her expertise as a leader, practitioner, author, and facilitator of adaptive leadership for social change. As the co-founder and director of Collaboration for Impact, Liz brings unique experiences, skills, and knowledge to the development of collaboration, which enables cross-sector stakeholders to change the way that they work together and to create positive social change. Collaboration for Impact is Australia's industry leader in equipping people with the skills that they need to tackle complex problems through effective collaboration. Liz provides advice, input, and capacity building to governments, not-for-profits, corporates, philanthropists, and community leaders on the leadership and collaboration required to achieve systems change. In this role, she also lectures on the skills and practice for collaborative leadership at the Centre for Social Impact at the University of New South Wales. In many ways, Collaboration for Impact is a peer organization to the Tamarack Institute, and so we're very excited to have Liz join us for this webinar and for the workshops on adaptive leadership skills for a changing world. So welcome, Liz.
Thanks, Liz. Great to join you from Australia this very early morning.
Yeah, and later in the afternoon for all of us on this side of the world. So we're very appreciative that you're taking time and have gotten up at the crack of dawn to join us. We've got a series of questions that we're going to ask you during the course of this webinar. And so our first one is for you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and also tell us about the work you're leading in Australia and a little bit more about Collaboration for Impact.
Sure. Well, I guess I'd start by, you can probably, people can probably pick up by my accent that it's not very Australian. I'm from Scotland originally. I came out to Australia 18 years ago, but in Scotland, I worked managing grassroots not-for-profits. And I think there the key path that led me on was the organizations I was working in very much had at their core the idea that the people and communities we were working with had the wisdom to solve their own problem. So when I came to Australia, I continued that work in organizations and got a bit curious about how do we start to tackle some of these issues at the core. And that took me into exploring what kind of leadership we need, where we've got to bring all sectors together to try and tackle the issues. So I worked in social leadership for about 10 years, really exploring that practice and looking at what it takes to build capacity, bring people along, to lead in a way that can tackle system change. And that led me to where we are today in setting up a Collaboration for Impact with Kerry Graham. And now we walk alongside many collective impact initiatives, but also many initiatives just trying to mobilize community and bring all players to the table. So that's kind of a bit about me, but like you said, Collaboration for Impact is a peer. I guess we look to what's been happening in Canada and other countries around this work to learn into it. But where we're at now, we've been going now a couple of years, and we basically are working to try and build capacity to address the root causes. So we're looking at how do we really shift the conditions that keep complex problems in place? And we do that by walking alongside communities. We're embedded in a number of communities. We provide a learning calendar and do workshops on a whole range of different skills, from developmental evaluation right through to leadership, how we mobilize community, and how we design for collaboration.
So here's some of your core values. So I think what we share in common between Tamarack and Collaboration for Impact is this notion that that all voices need to be included in community change efforts.
Yeah, we're really focusing on how do we build communities that can thrive, and we follow a line, if you like, around adaptation, which is what I'm going to be talking today, that we're adapting all the time, but we want to help build capacity so people can do that well. And where we're at in Australia, it's early days in this work around collective impact. I would say what's happening in Canada is maybe 10 years ahead, but what we're seeing is roughly around 75 different collaborative change processes, all at very different stages. And the common trends around them in Australia is that there are, most of them are place-based. Some of them are looking at specifically an issue, like illicit drugs or countering violent extremism. Almost all of them have some form of backbone in whatever form that is, and that goes from fairly sophisticated to being landed in one person. And I guess the most common issue that we see that people are focusing on in Australia is really that early intervention stage, about how do we get better outcomes for children, young people, and families. In viewing that, I guess what we see is there's a number of dynamics which are playing out when we look across what's happening in Australia. And if we can go to the next slide, what we see is that everybody really wants to collaborate, but few, people are starting off going, yes, we need change. We need to come together and work differently. But when it comes to that, they often don't want to do the change themselves. So it's a very common pattern, I guess, we see in adaptive change. So a lot of our work is on how do we try and create the conditions for that change to happen, when it means everybody's got to adapt in a different way and we bring everyone to the table.
So these are the trends. So one of the things that we thought we would do in this conversation is talk about some trends. And I know that, Liz, you've identified, I think, 5 trends that we're going to talk about now. And the first one is this one about, while people do want to collaborate, they actually don't want to change themselves.
Moving on from that idea about change is that we see that there's general agreement that we need to move away from more siloed responses and we need to coordinate effort. We also see, if we go to the next point, that we need to share data with each other and to try and get different agencies and representatives coming together to do that is a lot of the work. People are coming into the collaboration seeing that it requires them to take up a different role and not come in necessarily as expert, but to hold their expertise lightly and come into a learning environment. And we also, there's a general acknowledgement that there needs to be a greater risk and appetite for innovation. But I guess what we see is, whilst in a way this is a kind of intellectual acknowledgement that we see, that predominantly the bottom line is we agree to do this as long as it doesn't need to really necessarily affect us individually or our organization's brand, our strategy or business model. So again, this pattern around it's everyone else, it's great if everyone else changes, but it's much harder when it comes to the work that we might need to do in our individual organizations.
That's really interesting, because in fact, one of the things that we've noticed in Canada, just building on that, is that the system sometimes prevents you. So it might be that the individual wants to change, but the system holds you almost intractable in your change, right? So it's kind of interesting that there's both the individual kind of experience and then also the system experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we work strongly with is people understanding that systems are ruthless recruiters of the status quo, that even if you've got very strong change agents within your system, the system's patterns and ways of doing things will constantly keep bringing you back to status quo, which is why we believe this adaptive practice, which is not just about how do you adapt, but how do you enable your system to adapt as well, is quite a key component. So the second trend that we see is really around this idea of power, which I'll be talking about quite a bit through adaptive leadership. But It's really this question, which I think is at the core of collaboration, collective impact, is are we ready to really share power, and what does that look like? So an acknowledgement that, you know, collaboration means that we need to give up or lose potentially some attribution, which is that, you know, my organization will get all the kudos for doing this, or that the impact can be attributed to just one entity. It's also about losing, in a way, that competitive advantage that you might have by your brand, your leverage, your influence. And it's about losing the idea of being an expert versus, you know, how do we share our understanding and knowledge, and ultimately letting go of what we would call one of the trolls of collaboration, of control. That, you know, we love to know what's going to happen, that certainty and comfort and predictability that we have when we are delivering programs, versus the type of adaptive, emergent practice that's required in adaptation. So really it's getting people to give up things on a whole range of levels, and we very rarely talk about loss. And I think fundamentally what we're talking about is how do we share power with communities. You know, a lot of the work in Australia is, it's a slightly different dynamic from Canada, where it's very dependent on government and government's role within the collective impact and collaborations. And there's a tension between government being there and letting go of control, and trusting being able to work differently with community. So we see that's one of the kind of key dynamics, is how do we enable this power sharing, and for community to take up their power, but for government to use their power in a different way. So if we look at the next trend, it's what we would call a premature agenda setting, is that we, a lot of collaborations kicking off, we see jump very quickly to setting an agenda, coming up with what their shared purpose is, when often the preconditions aren't really in place, or they haven't, they're not strong enough for the work. And I guess this is a tension all the time, because it's that tension that's been identified before about we want to jump to the outcome rather than staying in the process. So we work with the collaborations with on have they really found, identified, and being able to bring together people from all parts of the system, not just the usual suspects, and taking the time to really build the trust, build the relationship, learn into it. What does it mean to work in this way? I think it's often seen as a luxury to do that work up front, as opposed to seeing that that's kind of essential to be doing that as you go along. And again, that clear buy-in and understanding that we've got to be able to challenge and look at existing ways of doing things, and to see what's working and what might we need to tweak. And fundamentally, this idea of, is there enough urgency and authority to be able to hold the collaborative change process? And how can we build that urgency if it's not already there? So I think that pull all the time to, we've got to define what this work is. We've got to define the impact and outcome when a lot of the foundations aren't yet in place. The next trend is around this idea of, we're still really pulled into the idea of another program, and I'd be really curious to see what it's like in Canada, but in Australia we love programs. So you know, if we can just come up with another program, we think that's going to fix it. What we find, though, is that that kind of dominance of programmatic thinking is that whilst it may have outcomes for a small population group that are transformative, it's only going to ever address one part of the system. And it's usually in the area of service provision. And I think the trap that we see is when particularly the service system comes together, is we very quickly go into coordinating what's already going on and trying to integrate services. And while that's needed and useful, again, community is often not involved in that process. And it's only one part of the system. And I guess we see this other trend where a real pull to evidence and getting data can be seen as a way of avoiding taking risks. And what we mean by that is that we see people, you know, potentially doing more of what we know works, that we've seen it play out in another community, and we're just going to land it into our community, but we haven't looked at what are the conditions that are going to make that work. And obviously, you know, context is king. We've got to be able to read the context. And so what we're trying to encourage is, how do we use that evidence as a tool to go, we've got data that this works here, how do we use that and learn into what might work in the communities we're in? But it's a real pullback to coming up with a program that we might know how to do.
And sometimes I think we fall into this trap, and we've seen this time and time again in Canada as well, that you fall into the trap that if we just get a little bit more information, or if we just get a little bit more data, we can find the perfect solution, right? And so perfect becomes the enemy of the good, or the good enough. And I think that you're absolutely right. It's that kind of either do things that we already know that we think are proven, or we fall into the loop of endless research and endless data because nothing is compelling us enough to act. So I think, you know, that trend we see a lot at Tamarack as well in terms of community change.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is, you know, it's probably the same there, Liz, that it's being driven often by those external forces around, we've got to get outcomes. And so the pull to be an expert, which is what we get rewarded for in the more technical work we do, will always kind of win out. So it's a constant tension. And I think finally, I guess on a positive note, what we've seen are some of the challenges that we face that I've talked to already. But the positive side of that is that we are seeing, you know, there's more than 75 initiatives that are looking at trying to get systems change. People are using the language. I think that's really important, that people are trying on the language to go, what does this mean for us in our context, and playing with it a bit. And so people might be saying we're doing collective impact, but they're, you know, they might only be coordinating or cooperating at that point, but they're starting the work, yeah? So I think that's a really positive thing. Then you can actually work on what's required and what's the response given the conditions. One of the key positive trends we see is that increasingly that role of backbone is being valued, that people are either looking at how they can create that or second staff to it, and in some areas now starting to fund the backbone. It's still difficult to get people sharing data, particularly among different government agencies, but there are now protocols being established, and it's getting easier. People know they need to do it. They're just working with the trolls around, how do we let go of this, and how do we come up with a way that's going to work for us? And overall, what we're seeing at a government level is that there is an authorizing environment being created through policy, that's looking at the questions are being asked and the dialogue around how can we enable place-based practice on the ground, an acknowledgement that we need to work differently and we need to get decision-making closer to communities, to the people who are most affected by the issues. And in some instances, people and units are being freed up to innovate and try different ways of doing things, using co-design, using a whole range of other things. And in that, you know, having some really interesting discussions around different finance models, social impact bonds, other things that are coming into play, that the questions are being asked about how can we procure and how can we support and evaluate initiatives that are trying to change the systems at a community level. And that's a new frontier in many ways. So the conversation started. So I reckon that's a good thing. It's kind of one step at a time.
It's really interesting to think about these trends and how they are playing out both in Australia and in Canada. I think we see many of the same kind of trends moving forward as well. So our next question is just kind of leading off of the trends. The next question really leads us into this notion of adaptive leadership, right? Because things are dynamic. We see this particularly from the perspective of community change efforts. So can you describe kind of your approach to adaptive leadership and the type of leadership that it is required in this kind of dynamic flow?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the key thing, adaptive leadership comes out of from Heifetz and Linsky, who are based at Kennedy School at Harvard. But I guess what we've been working on is how do you adapt this way of working in a social context? But the principles are really embedded on that theory. And fundamentally, how I'll describe it, and this comes from Heifetz and Linsky, is that we're talking about that adaptive leadership is the practice of mobilizing people to tackle tough challenges and to thrive. And that really the kind of essence of leadership is that it's something that we can all do, that leadership is a practice, it's not a position. We need to build our muscles to be able to do it. And the purpose of applying adaptive leadership is that you're fundamentally trying to get the systems to face a new reality, because we don't adapt very quickly as human beings and systems. So often we've got to mobilize people to try and tackle those tougher problems and challenge what is it about status quo that's not working any longer that we need to shift or change. And how do we all collectively then take responsibility to work across the different perspectives on what change is going to be required for common goals. And I think the key thing that, I've already alluded to is that leading in this kind of environment usually involves some kind of loss. And we very rarely discuss that what we're normally doing is we don't yet know what the solution's going to look like or where we're going to move to. So we've got to hold people through a process of where there's often a perception of loss, is that in this change, we all may stand to lose something. So I often think that's the crux of adaptive leadership, is that we know that we're dealing with a perception of loss, then our work is then in a way more compassionate, but what we're trying to do is bring everybody along.
It's kind of interesting. Earlier today, I was in a conversation with a colleague and we talked about the notion of openings and closings, right? And I think in both cases, we're not very good at thinking through strategically what the opening should be. And then we also don't have a good sense, and it deals with loss to some degree, but what the closings are and how we build in some structure and symbols into those openings and closings to make them more real for people. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Liz, and that, when we're working with communities who are trying to get systems change, we're in that loop all the time. Around how do we kind of create something new while at the same time we've got to let go of something as we go, and we're not good at letting go of things. We always want to keep doing everything that we've always done. So really what this type of leadership requires us to be thinking about is how do we bring everybody together who is impacted by the issue or who's got a stake in the issue. And what you're trying to do is enable everyone to adapt to that new reality well. And I think this is key because, if we look around us in the world, we're adapting all the time, but often, the adaptation is going to be driven by the stronger forces. So I think intervening and trying to build a practice of adaptive leadership is to try and help communities adapt in a way which works for the majority, not for the minority, if you like, that it's bringing everybody along, or as many as possible. And I think what we tend to do is, in those situations, we become very reliant on people in authority to fix the problem for us, that we're looking at why doesn't government or why doesn't the local council or whoever it is just fix this and take action, when these type of challenges are ones which require all of us to be engaged in it. So it requires us to kind of be understanding a practice and applying a practice as opposed to taking up a role or a position of the leader. We're working with this idea that we can all exercise leadership, but we also need to exercise authority at different times as well. And to do that, we need to understand, what's the difference between exercising authority, when do we exercise leadership, and guiding that is how do we understand the difference between a technical and an adaptive challenge. And fundamentally, I think it requires a holding environment to keep us in the work, because what we're doing is we're having to learn into what's required, and we need a container or a holding environment to do that. How we define the difference between the technical and adaptive challenge is that the technical challenges are known. They're ones that, we've solved before, we've got the experience to do it, and we've got the capacity. There's a formula, a recipe, we've got program specifications, and it requires us, and fundamentally, technical challenges require us to respond. They don't require us to change. So we can respond to technical challenges, whereas when it comes to an adaptive challenge, they're outside of our own expertise. We may all have a different view on what the challenge is, and they're outside of our capacity, that even if we keep chucking all of our programs at this issue, the problem's going to continue. And what they require is that everybody involved has got to change something, and it's usually ways of doing things, the belief around what the issue is. It's our behaviors, our values, and our loyalty. So adaptive challenges require us to change, whereas technical challenges require us to respond. And I think fundamentally under the surface, we're negotiating these three core adaptive questions, which is, what is it about the way we've been working that we should keep, that we should conserve, develop, nurture, and keep on doing? What is it that we should stop or let go of or discard? Or we might just have to tweak it a bit. And where do we innovate? And, if we think about the dialogues we're in and collaborations, these three conversations are always playing out. There's always someone advocating for one of these areas, but it's usually under the surface. And it's often very rarely surface, because we would very quickly get into areas of values and beliefs, identity, belonging. It's very rarely around technical things. So once we go deeper into these areas, we can see that fundamentally why people resist this type of change, because it may mean they've got to give up something that they're trying to really hold on to.
That's really interesting. And I read something from Forbes magazine recently where they talked about it, are you an adaptive leader? And I think it's quite consistent with this, right? It's kind of like, what are the values that you hold? What's your justice approach? What are some of, what's your emotional intelligence, and how is it related to this? And how can you bring those skill sets into being an adaptive leader? So it's really interesting to think about, the things that in ourselves as leaders we're willing to give up and go into that more vulnerable space, and also the things that we want to hang on to, because it's how we define ourselves as a leader.
Yeah, and I think that insight, Liz, is, that's happening for people individually, but it's happening systemically as well when we come together in collaboration. So I think the more we get tuned into asking those questions and looking for it, the more we can see, well, what am I willing to give up?
So just building on that, I think it leads nicely into the book that you were one of the co-authors around, called Lost Conversations, Finding New Ways for Black and White Australians to Lead Together. It is that kind of notion of being adaptive and being resilient. So can you maybe share some of the insights that you've learned from that book and from the process of kind of connecting with the other co-authors in terms of writing the book?
Yeah, so this process, the book really came out of a process which was for 4 or 5 years, which was with a group of Indigenous leaders from across Australia that we convened, and it was when I was working in social leadership. And we worked with this group for a number of years, and we found a number of patterns or dynamics playing out, which we also experienced in other cross-cultural spaces. So we leaned into it basically, and we collectively named, what is it that we're seeing playing out? This seems to happen when we come together as Indigenous Australia and what we would call white Australia, which is a large generalization, but just to kind of, we kind of simplified it for this process. And we saw these patterns that everyone went, yeah, these things play out all the time, but we never talk about them. And so what we did then was leaned into it. And we were in a process with 6 Indigenous leaders and 3 white leaders, which was myself and 2 other colleagues, where we basically had to use ourselves as a case in point. And we worked on our own learnings through working together. So we were both trying to develop an initiative together and then reflect on how we were going at the same time across the cultural lens, if you like. And fundamentally what we looked at this through a lens of power, that in trying to exercise leadership, it was what was playing out all the time was the dynamics around our awareness and our use of power and the impact of that. But what we noticed was a number of common patterns where, when we start to come together and work together across culture, we saw that, there's this idea that we can fix Indigenous Australia and that it's a problem to be fixed, and that the problem is defined elsewhere, usually by white Australia. And that constantly played out and, of course, started off the dynamic or the collaboration straight away in a place where people were seeing the issue in a very different way. And I guess fundamentally, and this was happening for the people in the room we were working with, that, the dynamics in this work are really unsustainable, that we do very kind of short-term focused initiatives on problems which are complex and are going to be multi-generational and take time. And, we burn through people, that it ends up being a few champions or a few warriors who take up particular roles. And that really, that often the work is outsourced to a department or a particular person who's got the role to work on reconciliation. And it's one person within a large organization. So, we outsource the problem, but we don't actually embed it systemically. And, it's really ultimately what we're seeing is benefiting the status quo. So we saw that these were traps that, unconsciously often the systems were falling into. And the patterns that happened when we came together, and we saw again, this was around when we're not aware of the power we've got or how that's playing out, that what we were both doing was reverting to our own kind of biases and norms when we weren't sure what to do, or we were scared of getting it wrong or saying the wrong thing. And it was hard for anybody to own their power, if you like, and to see that they had power. So what we ended up doing was basically nobody was taking up power or leadership because the environment was too conflicted to do that. The pattern that we start to see is, that it's very hard to look ahead and plan into the future and look at what we could create, because the present dynamics are so consuming, if you like, but also so stuck. And fundamentally, I guess what we saw underneath that was that the skill or the way through this that we needed was to be able to create environments and have a practice and a way of working where we could have conflict together, where we could actually raise some of the questions and to be frank, to have arguments, to be able to challenge each other and challenge norms. And, that's very difficult to do in this environment. It was only when we did that that we were able to get some relief and felt, particularly from the Indigenous Australian leaders side, they were saying, okay, we can start to do business with you now. We can start to work together because you're bringing in your vulnerability and you're bringing in, you're challenging us, and we all need to learn collectively. So this idea around, I think, and in that we stop being generous and we stop empowering each other. So yeah, that was kind of what we saw playing out, and the way through it was really about owning our power and seeing that power play out. So that's what we've written about in the book, is really that experience at a personal level and a system level. So yeah.
It's interesting, right? Because it ties into the next question, which is that you move beyond the surface relationships to these kind of relationships of really building trust between people, especially when it comes to this notion of sharing leadership, right? And I think it is that kind of, how do we adapt the ways that we show leadership, or that we show up for leadership or lean into leadership in a way that actually becomes transformative? And what are the things that you've learned in your work and in your practice around trust?
Yeah, look, I think that's key, Liz. And I mean, the leaning in is the real part to it, about having environments where we can work with conflict. I mean, conflict is just that you and I see this issue differently, and we desperately need that in collaborations. We need to tap into that. So I think what we find, though, is we can't do that in the normal working environments that we have. So we've got to create a container, a holding environment to allow there to be difference and to build relationship. And I think that's the learning edge, is that we need to have conflict, but we need to build relationship to do that. And we shy away from that. We shy away from creating spaces to do that. And what we need, and in that, and these are skills that we can learn, is that we need to build skills. And how do we keep that kind of conflict at a productive level? Now, there's a cultural aspect to this as well. Being from Scotland, you know, we've got we argue about everything. You know, it's just part of the culture. It's like, get it out on the table and thrash it out. And then when I came to Australia, I really noticed that people deal with conflict in a very different way. It's all, you know, we need to be mates. We've got a strong mateship value. So I think this is contextual as well, that we've got to learn either how to, sometimes it can be too much. How do we either turn it down, or how do we keep it at a level where people are able to bring in their different views and it's safe enough to do that? And to do that, it means we've all got to work together to be curious about that, you know, the no voice, the one that often we see as inconvenient. And in collaborations, we might be, you know, going really strong and we're making progress, and then someone's the party pooper and, you know, starts to block it. That's actually a really, there's a lot of wisdom in that view. So a lot of this is, how do we lean into that rather than try and avoid it? And what I find is, by being willing to stay in these conversations and stay at the table, is what enables trust to come. That, you know, when we work with the role the person's bringing in, not the person themselves, that they're bringing in a role which is about safety or caution, we need to work with that theme, as opposed to, you know, it's Liz is the one saying it. And I think fundamentally this idea that, you know, we often hear, particularly in a lot of the contexts we work in cross-culturally, that people saying we can't collaborate because we don't have trust. And I guess we'd reframe that to say, well, trust isn't a prerequisite. If we wait for it, it may never happen, but we're going to get it by doing the work together and staying at the table and seeing that it's safe enough for us to have different views and work on that, and to have something new come out of it. And what I found is building in a practice where you're doing the work in the collaboration, but then you're constantly reflecting on the collaboration. How are we going? How are we traveling? How are we dealing with the issues, or are we taking them out into the car park at the beginning of the meeting or the end of the meeting? And, you know, fundamentally that means we've got to be vulnerable. We've got to own that if we're part of the solution, we're also part of the problem. And we've got to be able to be vulnerable to show we're willing to give something up in the process, or not know what to do. And that's hard, you know, we're kind of skilled to be experts. So I think, and fundamentally, and, you know, I guess we get caught up in the work here that we can forget to acknowledge and help people see where we're making progress. Sometimes it can be hard to see that. So I think fundamentally it's this idea of, we need, if we're going to build trust, we've got to design and build spaces for trust building, that we can't just assume it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think, you know, that's a really interesting point in terms of all of these, in terms of building trust, but also thinking about them in the frame or in the lens of adaptive leadership. I know that the curriculum that we're putting together for this workshop, this masterclass, is going to explore these concepts more deeply, and we'll spend time with the group doing some work around each of these concepts. I wonder, though, my final question before we turn it over to the audience is, what are you most looking forward to or most excited about in terms of coming to Canada and spending 2 weeks with us, going from one side of the country to the other?
Oh, well, look, I'm very excited. I've never been to Canada, so that's first up is the reason I'm really excited about it. But I'm really curious about, obviously this work in collective impact has been happening longer there. So to be learning firsthand with the people in the room about, what are you grappling with there, and what are some of the contextual differences? What does it look like there and compared to in Australia, and particularly in the community mobilization area, because that's something we're really grappling with in Australia. So I really want to learn about how are you and how are the communities in Canada really doing that work of mobilizing from the grassroots up, because it's a real gap and it's very needed here. And yeah, look, I'm looking forward to, I think we're going to be able to have a bit of time in the Rockies as well. So I'm looking forward to having a wander about and maybe seeing a bear. I hear that they may be around. So yeah, but really interested in learning what's going on.
For sure. Well, hopefully, I can't guarantee bears. We never know. It is their springtime, and they're busy doing some other stuff at that time of year. But we'll see. So now I want to turn it back over to Duncan. I know he's been monitoring the questions that we have from the audience, and wondered if there's any questions that have come forward for, Skelton as we go forward.
Yeah, lots of good questions so far. And if you have a question and you haven't had the chance to ask it, feel free to type that into the question or chat box on the GoToWebinar control panel. First question comes from Kelsey. So we were talking about leadership and authority. And so Kelsey's question is, how can we exercise authority in a way that supports collaboration and leadership from all?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kelsey. I think the key thing around authority, and I think we often get confused with being authoritarian, is that, authority is a really core function for any system. That often, actually, a lot of the challenges we have is when people don't exercise authority. And what we're talking about in authority is really three functions of providing direction, providing order, and protecting the system. So knowing when do we need that to keep everything moving and operating, and when do we actually start to open up questions and not provide direction, and when do we challenge the norms rather than maintaining the norms, and when do we allow difference in rather than protecting the system from difference, is the tension. So I think first of all, your question, it's understanding deeply the need for authority and when do we apply that. But it's what is called in adaptive leadership the razor's edge, because we're constantly dancing on the edge of the razor about, are we providing too much authority so the system's not learning, or are we not providing enough so they're going to push back? So I think that's really the art of what we would call, the art of adaptive leadership, where you're kind of dancing on that edge all the time, and it's a practice. But yeah, it's definitely something we're going to go into more deeply during the masterclass.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question comes from Glenn. How do you hold people back from agenda setting when quite often urgency is related to a particular subject or topic, and sometimes that's the reason around which people first came together in the first place?
Yeah, great question. I think, the holding back piece from agenda setting is more, maybe it's reframing that sometimes the urgency is to jump there, is maybe reframing that around that actually all we can do is be coming up with a range of hunches or hypotheses around what the agenda is. So I think once we get into that practice of having, using our observations, using the data about what is going on in the communities, and let's test those hunches, which will help build the agenda. And I think it's reframing that once people see that that is the work, then they still feel we are still doing something. I think that pull to doing something is really strong. So having a strong authorizing environment where you've got people who understand the nature of the work, who can protect that and provide space for that, and working on developing hunches while you're building the foundations. So I don't think it's a linear process. I think we can be doing, walking and chewing gum at the same time. So we can be working on testing our hunches to develop the agenda while building the foundations. I guess the point I wanted to make is that often we leave that work of foundation building and we often have to go back and retrofit. So leverage it, and I think the piece about urgency is if you've got the urgency there, that's a great lever. So how do you leverage it but manage it at the same time so that you can bring people into what is required to respond to this as opposed to jumping to another program or business as usual.
I think just building on that, we can bring in some of the social innovation tools into this as well. So one of the things is maybe doing some prototyping. So rather than making a big bet, doing some small bets, still responding in some way to the urgency, but advancing some small bets or some small prototypes to see what's the reaction around those small prototypes in a variety of different ways. The other thing that I would add, Liz, to your comment is to also check yourself to make sure that the voices in the room represent different components of the problem, right? Sometimes we gather people in the room and we have the same, cultural norms, or we're from the same socioeconomic group. And so we don't actually get that 360 lens of the problem. And so that's another step in terms of, before you jump to the solution, make sure that you've got that 360 lens so that you're unpeeling the onion in the right way so that you're getting to kind of the root cause of the problem and bringing that lens in from a whole variety of different perspectives.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you both. Our next question is from Janine. And Janine's curious if either of you have experienced this when in an established group that's committed to naming and giving up power for the good of the group, but sometimes there is one or two players that behave contrary to that commitment. How do you handle that?
So, sorry, Duncan, can you just repeat that? It's about naming and giving up power?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's an agreement to give up the power, but then when push comes to shove, there's one or two players that don't act in accordance with that.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really common dynamic. I mean, and maybe that slide that came up before around understanding what's going on under the surface around what are you asking people to give up? What does it really mean to give up power and let go of that and move on? That the work is often how do we explore that role of the no, the role that won't come along. And I think it's probably the most common dynamic that we work with collaborations on, that, it's like we're all changing, but they're not. And I think so a lot of the work is, first of all, understanding, helping people have those conversations about what's going on under the surface. I think what can often happen is we scapegoat those people who are really struggling to come along and to shift and to change. And I think there's a level of compassion, and sometimes that can be really hard because they're being seen as the problem, and may well be. But leaning into that to work with, I guess, and a lot of the principles of deep democracy are useful in this context about understanding what do they need to come along, and is that something that the group can provide, and sometimes it may not. And the other part of adaptive work is accepting that there will be loss, that not everybody can or will or wants to or is able to. So again, I think this is where having processes and a practice and a way of working where you can surface the dynamic, you can then work with it directly, try and bring people along, but also have a system where you can acknowledge that there will be loss, but how do we help people do that well?
Oh, thank you for that.
What are your thoughts?
Just looking at the time, where a question that's related to what you just spoke on, it's from Tara. Can you provide some examples of loss, particularly in smaller communities? Because we've talked about the need sometimes for loss and sometimes people not being ready to do so. What exactly do you mean when you speak about loss?
Yeah, look, it's going to look different in each context, but I'd say there's certain themes that what we're usually talking about is a loss of, in collaboration, we may fear losing resources, money, branding, staff often in a lot of the regional areas here, that there's a very real competition for resources and skilled staff. So if we come together into collaboration, we want to get we may lose the best people, but it's often stuff that's below the neck. It's often things like power, that we've got to give up power, like was asked in that previous question, status, but also, and increasingly we see this, that when you're bringing people together and saying we've got to work differently, it's often can tap into senses of people's identity and expertise and competency. So if I've only trained in one area all my life and I'm really good at that, but that's programmatic and it's dealing with simple or technical challenges, and I might have to work differently and reskill. And how I may hear that is that actually, my skills aren't sufficient in this area, and that might be very tied up with my sense of self and who I am and what I'm good at. And I think we see that playing out a lot, where we're bringing, people who've been in a field, a specialism all their life, and we want them to bring that, but we want them to hold it lightly so that they can learn new ways. That's a tough ask if you've been doing the same thing for a long time. So I think we've got to know that that's the type of loss. And again, I think I'd really stress it's the fear of loss. Often we don't lose that identity. We don't lose power really massively, but it's the fear of that which will stop us making the change.
Well, thank you so much for that insight. And just looking at the time, I think we're just about at the end of our discussion. I just wanted to thank you, Liz, for sharing your insights, and for Liz Weaver as well for guiding the discussion. And thank you to everyone who attended today as well for your thoughtful questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's our pleasure to have you. Coming up in just a few weeks, we're going to be hosting our new Adaptive Leadership Masterclass series that will be led by Liz Skelton and Liz Weaver. These one-day events will take place in Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, and Ottawa beginning May 23rd. So there's a link on your screen that you can follow if you want to dive deeper into this conversation, hear more about adaptive leadership and trust, and just take this conversation a little bit further. These masterclasses will build on what we've discussed today, with a focus on tools and practices to help understand the how and why behind leading adaptively within your own collaborative initiatives. This is a really unique learning opportunity that is filling fast, so please follow the link to learn more and register. The registration links for the Masterclass series will be shared with you by email, along with a recording of this talk and a copy of the slides and any other resources that we mentioned throughout the call. So as I mentioned, in a few days, you'll receive our follow-up email, which will include a link to the recording of today's call, as well as to the Adaptive Leadership Masterclass. To learn more about upcoming learning opportunities, including workshops and free webinars like this one, you can visit us at tamarackcommunity.ca. And we also encourage you to take a minute to complete a short webinar survey to offer feedback on how you enjoyed today's call. Thank you again, both Liz Weaver and Liz Skelton, and thank you everyone else for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful day.